Does the Bible prescribe a day of worship? This battle has been going on for hundreds of years in the United States, and it certainly goes back way beyond that, clear back to the Ugaritic word sabutu that most scholars feel to this day represents the Sabbath, but not everyone out there in academia feels that the term sabutu is the equivalent of the term Shabbat, but it certainly is very close. How do we actually evaluate this material? Now, we do know that ancient world gods in the Mediterranean all had a temple. They all had a date for worship. In other words, it was like keeping a date with God. Some have suggested the Sabbath is like a walk or a park in time, that it is a date with God, if you will. Now, the Sabbath, theologically, if you'll follow it through from Genesis to Revelation, never really changes in the day that it is to be kept. If you look at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, you see it says there remains a Sabbatizing in Greek. It's a little tough to translate there, for the people of God. And you can see the historical antecedent, even though a future participle is used. Now, some will interpret this and say, well, the future participle means that it will be the Sabbath in the millennium or the New World. While that is the intended meaning, don't forget the phrase that says, there remains. Okay? And if it remains, there is obviously something that was present with the early church. Now, what about the Sabbath as an application for the Jewish people? Well, the Sabbath reminds us of creation. All you have to do is read Genesis 2 and go through the days of creation, and one can see in the ancient temple readings of Genesis what Shabbat reminded us of, the completeness of creation. Now, it's also the day God rested. Now, it's interesting when we take a look at what we call covenants. What does it mean to covenant one's self? It means to Sabbath one's self. And people, I'm sure, are listening to this, and I'm sure you're wondering, why hasn't anybody told me that before? So when we start talking about the new covenant, it's almost like the term Hadash in Jeremiah 31:31, where we seven ourself. Shavah, you see. And so you really cannot separate in Old Testament theology the Sabbath from creation, the Sabbath from worship of deity, and you can't separate it at all from social justice. At Andrews University many years ago, there was a PhD dissertation, and it was entitled The Sabbath and Social Justice. And it was tying together the concept of Sabbath, because you had a land Sabbath and the Sabbath obviously pictured a time when the final Jubilee would indeed be executed, and social justice that never was permanently issued would indeed be a final reality. Jeremiah kept predicting this. He wanted it. He felt if the people would come back from Babylon, they might understand this. Now, when the Bible talks about by the waters of Babylon, we sat down, it isn't there to tell us that we just sat down and had a picnic. It's trying to tell us that the Gentile powers who had us under their wing at the time did not have covenantal powers over the people. That's why Ezekiel talks about Kibar and being outside the city. You see, we just read right over these things and we really don't pay hell's worth of, if you'll pardon the pun, consideration to what that's really talking about. And the reason is we don't know about these terms. So we just read right over it and we say, well, isn't that a nice song? Or isn't that nice poetry? Or isn't it a nice story? But in reality, it's telling us something extremely profound. So back to our subject. Well, what about the day of worship? Israel was also told in the book of Jeremiah, and you can read it for yourself. When you read the indictments against the shepherds of Israel in Jeremiah 23 and other passages, they also, number one, are being judged because they did not keep Shabbat and they did not bring restoration to the land, beginning in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 7, that the 10 Commandments and the Shabbat, all 476 words or so, are all connected with the Aretz and the restoration of the land through Israel. What about the new covenant, Jeremiah 31:31? Well, that was obviously made with Israel, and it was to be connected with Israel in the latter days. And the term Hadash means more covenant renewal. We see this concept definitely in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we definitely see it in the New Testament, or renewed covenant would be a much better name for it. But I've heard that the day of worship changes in the New Testament. Well, the New Testament certainly takes the Sabbatarian concepts and enlarges them through the Haftalah and other concepts into the rising of Christ on the first day of the week. There are those who try to argue that Matthew 28:1 proves a Sabbath resurrection. They really are hard-pressed to prove this because Farrar Fenton was not correct in his translation many decades ago when he said, well, it's after the Sabbaths, plural. The plural there means days, that you're one day ek, or out of Sabbath, or away from Sabbath, and that would have been the first day of the week. And there's a coordinated conjunction there between the 2 days to actually explain that idiom. And of course, Rogers in his work, Beyond New Testament Basic Greek, will actually affirm what I just said. And so, as the wave sheaf or the ascension narratives were added to the church's worship structure, then of course Acts 20 verse 6 begins to make some sense, that there certainly was not a first day added as opposed to Sabbath worship, but in an addition to it. And the Sabbatarian churches in the U.S., which came out of the Millerite movement, have fought against this liturgical practice, yet it goes back to Syria. In the ancient Syriac versions of liturgical practices, it goes back to the Coptic Church. It goes back to the Church of the East, of the Malabar coast of the state of India in Kerala. It actually goes back to the Hebrew church at Lister and Icona and Iona and other places along the British Isles. So it's really nothing new. Wherever the original Hebrew church went, so did the Hebraic church practice of Sabbath worship. What about today? What would be wrong with having a Friday night Vespers? What would be wrong with, of course, doing social justice on Shabbat, just as Jesus did in the Gospels with the withered hand, and other acts of social justice, healing the blind, taking care of the sick, as a good physician would do. Then bringing our praises, our petitions, and our particular ministries to the first day celebrations, which would actually complete the worship cycle and prepare us for a glorious week to come, where ministries would go out into the world and bring their testimonies back into the full worship cycle, where a study of the Torah, a study of the prophets, and a study of the minor prophets right on into the Brit Hadashah over a 3.5 year reading cycle could be established to bring the power of Christianity back into the church, just as it was in the first century when it went to Asia Minor, then Europe, then North Africa, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth, as Acts chapter 1 states it did. The early church was not against one day or the other. The Apostle Paul is dealing with days of fasting that the Greek and pagan world did when he said one man keeps one day and one keeps another. It had nothing to do with the Saturday-Sunday controversy that has been erroneously created by the uninformed. Well, this is Father Tom Roberts saying, please worship this weekend in your community of faith and enter into the rest that the Apostle Paul talks about that will lead us to the kingdom of God and ultimate Sabbath worship by the resurrected Lord. Father Tom saying, thanks for listening.